French colonialism in Africa lasted 147 years, that is, from 1830 to 1977. It started with the French invasion of Algeria in 1830 until the independence of Djibouti on June 27, 1977. The French colonized 21 countries in Africa, the chief of which are Algeria, Senegal, Mali, Niger, Madagascar, and Djibouti. These countries, where French is spoken as an official language, are known as Francophone countries. For nearly a century and a half, France held sway over a significant colonial empire in Africa, weaving its influence from the Maghreb through the western and central sub-Saharan regions. The tale of French colonialism in Africa started in the 19th century with the bold move of seizing Ottoman Algiers in 1830. As the scramble for Africa intensified, the French expanded their dominion, claiming territories in West and Equatorial Africa. In the lead-up to the First World War, they established protectorates in Tunisia and Morocco, solidifying their presence in North Africa. Post-war adjustments saw France acquiring portions of German Togo and Cameroon, designated as League of Nations mandates. By 1930, the French colonial footprint stretched across vast territories, encompassing the confederations of French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa, the Western Maghreb, and the distant reaches of the Indian Ocean on islands like Madagascar, Reunion, and the Comoros. Djibouti, situated in the Horn of Africa, also found its place within this sprawling empire. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the French colonial endeavor bore the imprint of the civilizing mission. Rooted in the belief that Europe held the responsibility to bring civilization to supposedly backward people, this principle guided the French as they sought not only to govern but to assimilate their colonial subjects into Western ways. Unlike their British counterpart, who carried out an association policy in its colonies, the French championed assimilation across their colonial empire. The idea was simple. By embracing the French language and culture, colonial inhabitants could aspire to become French themselves. This extended beyond governance. Natives were considered French citizens upon adopting French customs, entailing both rights and duties. The roots of assimilation date back to the First French Empire during the 1789 Revolution. A law proclaimed in 1794 declared all residents in the colonies, regardless of color, as French citizens with constitutional rights. However, under Napoleon Bonaparte's rule in the early 19th century, new laws replaced the universal ones, rejecting assimilation in favor of separate laws for the colonies. Napoleon, fearing the influence of universal laws on local governance and cheap slave labor, reinstated slavery in the Caribbean possessions. Despite this setback, assimilation found support. In 1833, a law granted civil and political rights to all free colony residents. The revolution in 1848 restored the assimilation policy, but the strict separation persisted in most colonies, distinguishing between native Africans and Europeans with varying rights and duties. French citizenship for natives was deemed a privilege, subject to stringent conditions such as proficiency in French, a decent livelihood, and moral standards. From 1830 to 1946, only a limited number of native Algerians were granted French citizenship. While some criticize assimilation as a liberal fantasy, French administrators in the Protectorate of Morocco adopted a distinct approach. Focused on urban planning and colonial education, they aimed to preserve traditional society and prevent cultural mixing, albeit with mixed results. After World War II, Morocco's segregationist model fell out of favor, marking a brief resurgence of assimilationism. Within the vast expanse of French Africa, a silent resistance brewed against the backdrop of imperial authority and the so-called civilizing mission. Colonized communities devised intricate strategies to elude or challenge French rule, navigating the complexities of occupation and upheaval. Following the aftermath of the First World War, a fresh surge of organized dissent took center stage. Educated in the West, reformers, nationalists, and trade unions joined forces, orchestrating a nuanced campaign for a more equitable distribution of political and administrative power. Despite encountering frustrations during the interwar period, these impassioned calls for change laid the groundwork for the eventual dissolution of colonial bonds in the wake of the Second World War. As the winds of decolonization swept through Africa, endeavors to supplant imperial dominance with a federal framework stumbled. The turning point materialized in 1958 when a constitutional referendum opened the door for the majority of French territories in sub-Saharan Africa to assert their independence. Simultaneously, North Africa witnessed the tenacity of Tunisian and Moroccan nationalists, compelling negotiations for independence in the 1950s. However, the path to decolonization in Algeria unfolded in turmoil, marked by a protracted and brutal conflict involving 1 million European settlers, etching enduring scars on the fabric of both post-colonial states. Here are 10 facts about French colonialism in Africa. One, French colonial rule in Africa lasted for several centuries, spanning from the 17th century through much of the 20th century. It was one of the longest colonial enterprises on the continent. 2. French colonialism in Africa encompassed a vast array of territories, including present-day countries such as Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Senegal, Mali, Ivory Coast, Cameroon, Madagascar, and many others. 3. France implemented an assimilation policy in some colonies, particularly in West Africa, where the aim was to assimilate the local populations into French culture and society. This involved promoting the French language, education, and legal systems. 4. In other regions like North Africa, France adopted an indirect rule approach, allowing traditional local leaders to maintain some authority but under French oversight. 5. French colonialism in Africa was driven by economic interests. The colony served as a source of raw materials for the French industries. 6. The French colonies often relied on forced labor for various projects, including infrastructure development. This led to significant human rights abuses and exploitation of the local populations. 7. The experiences of French colonialism varied across regions, and the impact was not uniform. Different regions had different colonial policies, levels of resistance, and post-independence trajectories. 8. In the 1950s and 1960s, a wave of decolonization swept across Africa. Many French colonies gained independence during this period, marking the end of formal colonial rule. Some nations negotiated independence peacefully, while others, like Algeria, experienced protracted conflicts. 9. Despite gaining independence, the legacy of French colonialism continues to influence the social, political, and economic dynamics in many African countries. Issues such as language, legal systems, and economic ties still bear the marks of the colonial period. 10. After decolonization, many former French colonies in Africa became part of the Francophone, a monetary union where these countries pegged their currencies to the French franc, later to the euro. This arrangement maintained economic ties between France and its former colonies. French colonialism in Africa endured for a significant period, stretching across several centuries. From the 17th century through much of the 20th century, France maintained a colonial presence on the African continent. This era of French imperialism encompassed diverse territories and regions, characterized by varying degrees of direct and indirect rule. During this extended period, French colonialism in Africa saw the establishment of numerous colonies, protectorates, and spheres of influence. These included territories such as Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, Senegal, Mali, Ivory Coast, and others, each with its unique historical trajectory shaped by French colonial policies. The French colonial project in Africa involved a range of activities, including conquest, exploitation of natural resources, establishment of administrative structures, and imposition of cultural and linguistic assimilation policies. The French sought to extract wealth from their African colonies, often at the expense of local populations, while also seeking to spread the French language, culture, and civilization. The end of the French colonialism in Africa came in the mid-20th century as a wave of decolonization swept across the continent. African nations, inspired by nationalist movements and supported by international pressures, gained independence from colonial rule. This marked the culmination of centuries of resistance, struggle, and negotiation against French imperialism. Despite the formal end of colonial rule, the legacy of French colonialism continues to shape the socio-political, economic, and cultural landscapes of many African countries. Issues such as language, governance structures, economic dependency, and historical injustices remain significant challenges that post-colonial African nations grapple with as they navigate their path toward development and self-determination.